The wheat was close enough to touch. That is the detail the survivors kept coming back to, years afterward, when they tried to explain what it had actually been like. Not the flak, though there was more flak that day than any of them had ever seen or imagined. Not the fighters. The wheat. They were flying a 4-engine heavy bomber, a machine designed to cruise at 20,000 feet, and instead they were down among the sunflowers in the standing grain of the Romanian plain, so low that the propeller wash flattened the crops behind them, so low that soldiers on the ground were shooting down at them from the tops of oil derricks and grain silos and church towers. The waist gunner braced himself in the open window and looked ahead, and what he saw did not make sense. The target was already burning. He had been briefed on this refinery for weeks. He had studied the sand table and the reconnaissance photographs until he could have walked the place blindfolded. And now it was a solid wall of fire and boiling black smoke climbing 1,000 feet into the summer sky, and his airplane was going to have to fly straight through it. Somewhere inside the smoke were time delay bombs, dropped by the airplanes ahead of him, ticking down toward detonation. Somewhere inside it were barrage balloons trailing steel cables strong enough to shear a wing clean off, and his pilot was not turning away. None of them were turning away. They flew into the smoke because that was the mission, and the mission said, "Fly into the smoke." It was the 1st of August, 1943. The place was Ploesti in Romania, the single most important source of oil in Hitler's Europe. And the men flying into that fire were living through what would become, measured by proportion, the costliest single-day American airmen suffered in the entire Second World War. They called it Operation Tidal Wave. To the men who flew it, it became Black Sunday. 178 bombers took off that morning from the desert of Libya. 53 of them, and by some counts 54, never came home. 5 men would earn the Medal of Honor for what they did over those refineries, the most ever awarded for a single air action in American history. And 3 of those 5 would be dead before the medals were pinned to anything. And here is the part that has haunted this story for 80 years. The refineries they died to destroy were back in full production within a matter of weeks. This is the story of how that happened. How a plan drawn up by clever men who were nowhere near the target sent 1,000 young men down onto the deck against the most heavily defended patch of ground in Europe. And how nearly everything that could go wrong did go wrong. And how the courage of the crews turned out to be the only part of the whole enterprise that worked exactly as designed. To understand why anyone thought this was worth doing, you have to understand what Ploesti was. Romania had been an oil country since the middle of the 1800s, one of the first places on Earth to drill and refine petroleum on an industrial scale. By the time of the Second World War, the fields and refineries clustered around the town of Ploesti, about 35 miles north of the Romanian capital at Bucharest, were the beating heart of the Axis war machine's fuel supply. Winston Churchill called the Romanian refineries the taproot of German might. That was not rhetoric. That was targeting. Now, here you have to be careful with the numbers because the numbers get quoted loosely and this audience does not forgive loose numbers. You will hear that Ploesti supplied 60% of Germany's oil. You will also hear that it supplied about 1/3. Both figures are real, and they measure different things. The historian Mark Axworthy, whose work on the Romanian side of the war is about as authoritative as it gets, put Ploesti at roughly 35% of all Axis oil supplies in 1943. The National World War II Museum, measuring only crude oil going specifically to the Third Reich, puts the figure closer to 60%. The United States Strategic Bombing Survey, folding in the Hungarian fields as well, landed on about 1/4 of all Axis liquid fuel. Take whichever frame you like. They all point to the same conclusion. If you could turn off Ploesti, you could strangle the German war effort at the source. That idea, strangling the enemy at the source, is one of the oldest and most seductive ideas in air power. And I want to flag something right at the start, because it runs underneath this entire story. The theory of strategic bombing was that you could find the one vital organ in an enemy's economy, the ball bearing, the oil, the single irreplaceable thing, and you could reach out with bombers and destroy it and collapse the whole structure without ever fighting your way through the enemy's army. It is a beautiful theory. It promises a cheap, clean, decisive war. And over again in this period, that beautiful theory met reality, and reality won. And the men in the airplanes paid the difference. Ploesti is one of the purest examples of that pattern you will ever find. If you're finding this valuable, subscribing genuinely helps. It tells the algorithm this kind of deep research is worth showing to more people. A lot of you in the comments have been asking for this one, and some of you have personal connections to this story. I want to do it justice. Now, back to Ploesti. The decision to hit Ploesti was made at the highest level. At the Casablanca Conference in January of 1943, Roosevelt and Churchill agreed the Romanian oil complex was a priority target. It was partly a gift to the Soviets, who were bleeding on the ground in the East and wanted to see the Western Allies doing something that mattered. So the target came down from the top, from the politicians and the theater commanders, and it landed on the desks of the men who would have to figure out how to actually reach it. And that was the first problem. Reaching it at all. Ploesti sat deep inside enemy territory, far beyond the range of any escort fighter of the day. To strike it from the nearest Allied bases in Libya meant a round trip of nearly 2,400 miles, most of it over water, mountains, and hostile ground, with no friendly fighters within hundreds of miles for the entire flight. Only one airplane in the American inventory had the legs to make it. Not the B-17, the famous flying fortress of the campaigns over Germany. The B-17 simply could not carry enough fuel to go that far and come back. The airplane for Ploesti was the B-24 Liberator, a slab-sided, long-winged, ungainly-looking machine that most crews found harder to fly and less forgiving than the Fortress, but which could carry more bombs farther than anything else the Americans had. Everything about this raid was shaped by the range of that one airplane. The man given the job of planning it was Colonel Jacob Smart, an officer handpicked by General Henry Arnold, the commander of the Army Air Forces. And Smart looked at the problem and came to a radical, almost heretical conclusion. Remember, the entire doctrine of the American bomber force at this moment in the war was built on one idea: high altitude, daylight, precision bombing. You climbed to 20,000 feet or more, you flew in tight defensive formations, and you dropped your bombs through the Norden bomb site with what the doctrine promised would be pinpoint accuracy. That was the faith. That was what the crews had been trained for and what the airplanes had been built for. Smart's planners ran the arithmetic on hitting Ploesti that way, from high altitude, and the arithmetic was brutal. To be confident of destroying the refineries by conventional high-level bombing, they estimated you would need something on the order of 1,400 heavy bombers. They had fewer than 200. The math of the doctrine did not close. It did not come close to closing. So Smart proposed to throw the doctrine out. Instead of going high, he would go low as it was possible to fly. The bombers would come in at treetop height under the German radar, achieve complete surprise, and place their bombs by eye from a couple of 100 feet, where you almost could not miss. There is a brutal logic to it that is worth stating plainly, and one writer put it about as simply as it can be put. Bombing a target from 200 feet is less difficult than bombing it from 20,000. At minimum altitude, a much smaller force could do the work of a much larger one, and it could do it before the defenses even knew it was there. That was the theory. Surprise and accuracy bought by flying lower than anyone had ever taken heavy bombers into combat. I want to be fair to Colonel Smart here because it is easy in hindsight to call this reckless, and it was not simply reckless. Given the forces available and the range involved, the low-level plan was a genuinely creative answer to an almost impossible problem. The trouble was that it depended on a whole chain of things going right, and it depended above all on surprise, and surprise is the most fragile thing in warfare. Take surprise away, and a formation of heavy bombers flying straight and level at 200 feet is not a clever tactical stroke. It is a firing range, and the bombers are the targets. Through the summer of 1943, the crews trained for it in the desert south of Benghazi, in Libya. Engineers laid out a full-scale outline of the Ploesti refineries on the desert floor, marking the target buildings with poles and canvas, and the groups practiced diving on this mock target again and again, learning to fly in formation at heights where a moment's inattention put you into the sand. They studied models and maps and photographs until the layout of Ploesti was burned into memory. They flew 2 full dress rehearsals, and on the second one, they flattened the dummy refinery in about 2 minutes. Watching that, the planners let themselves believe it might actually work. There was, among the men who would fly it, a growing sense of dread as the day approached. These were not naive crews. Many had already flown combat and knew exactly what heavy anti-aircraft fire could do to an airplane, and the notion of holding a Liberator straight and level at rooftop height for minutes on end into a defended target did not require much imagination to frighten a thinking man. Some of the planners themselves privately expected to lose a large fraction of the force. General Ent, who would ride in the lead and command the mission in the air, is reported to have said beforehand that even if nobody came back, the results would be worth the cost. Sit with that sentence for a moment. It is the purest distillation of the mindset this channel keeps running into. The calculation made at the level of command that treats the men as a quantity to be spent, weighed on a scale against a target, and found acceptable. The men on the scale did not get a vote. The airplanes themselves were modified for the mission. Extra fuel tanks were fitted into the bomb bays, raising each Liberator's capacity to around 3,100 gallons, because without that fuel, none of them were getting home. The Norden bomb sites, useless at treetop height, were pulled out and replaced with simple low-altitude sites. Some of the lead aircraft had fixed machine guns bolted into the nose, fired straight ahead by the pilot, to hose down the gun positions as they came across the target. And a strict order went out across the whole force: radio silence. From takeoff to the target, no one was to key a microphone because a single stray transmission could give the game away and hand the enemy the surprise the entire plan depended on. There is an irony in that bomb site detail worth marking, because it goes to the heart of everything this channel is about. The Norden bomb site was the crown jewel of American bombing doctrine, the secret device that was supposed to make high-altitude precision possible, the very technology on which the whole theory of daylight bombing rested. And here, on the mission that most desperately needed accuracy, the planners pulled it out of the airplanes and set it aside, because at treetop height it was useless. The men were going to bomb the way bombers had bombed in the last war, by eye, by nerve, by flying straight at the thing and letting go at the last second. The most advanced bombing doctrine in the world had, for this one day, come all the way back around to the most primitive. The force that gathered at Benghazi came from 5 bomb groups, and any veteran of this air war will know their names. The 376th, the Liberandos, led by Colonel Keith Compton, who would fly the lead ship carrying the mission commander. The 93rd, Ted's Traveling Circus, led by Lieutenant Colonel Addison Baker. The 98th, the Pyramiders, led by Colonel John Kane, a big, blunt, hard-driving Texan whose crews called him Killer Kane. The 44th, the Flying 8 Balls, led by Colonel Leon Johnson. And the 389th, the Sky Scorpions, the newest and least experienced group, led by Colonel Jack Wood. Riding in the lead airplane, in overall command of the mission in the air, was Brigadier General Uzal Ent. The plan assigned each group its own targets among the 9 refineries, carved up into color-coded objectives: White 1, White 2, White 3, White 4, White 5, Blue, and Red. Astra Romana, the largest and most important of them all, went to Kane's Pyramiders. Concordia Vega went to Baker's Circus. The refinery at Campina, some distance to the north, went to Wood's Sky Scorpions. Smart's plan called for the destruction of more than 40 key installations across 7 target complexes, all of it to be done in a single coordinated pass. All 5 groups arriving within minutes of one another, hammer blows falling almost simultaneously, so the defenses never had time to recover between them. It was a piece of choreography as intricate as anything attempted in the air war. And choreography, as any dancer will tell you, falls apart the instant one performer misses a step. On the morning of the 1st of August, 1943, in the thin gray light before dawn, 178 liberators began taking off from the desert airfields around Benghazi. Roughly 1,750 young men were aboard them. And the mission began to come apart before the last airplane had even left Libyan soil. One of the heavily loaded bombers, straining to get off the runway in the desert heat with a belly full of fuel and bombs, lost power, swung off the strip, and cartwheeled into the ground in a spreading ball of fire. Its crew was gone before the formation had even assembled. That left 177 airplanes climbing out over the Mediterranean, forming up into their groups for the long flight north. Then the sea took the first navigator. As the formation droned out over the water, one of the lead ships of the 376th, an airplane named Wongo Wongo, suddenly pitched up, stalled, rolled over, and plunged straight into the Mediterranean, carrying its crew and one of the mission's most experienced navigators to the bottom. A second airplane dropped down low over the crash site to look for survivors, found none, and then discovered it was too heavily loaded to climb back up to the formation, and had to turn back for Africa. Just like that, before Romania was even in sight, the mission had lost aircraft it could not spare, and it had lost navigational leadership at the very front of the formation. And because of the radio silence order, nobody could talk about it. No one could reorganize. Every crew simply held course and kept the silence, exactly as ordered. Here's where the trouble began to compound, in the way that trouble does. Climbing to cross the mountains, the towering cloud-draped peaks of the Pindus Range on the border of Albania and Greece, the 2 lead groups, Compton's Liberandos and Baker's Circus, pushed their engines hard and climbed fast and punched up through the clouds. The trailing groups, Kane's desert-worn Pyramiders and Johnson's 8 Balls with tired engines and heavier going, climbed slower and went around the weather rather than over it. And a gap opened in the formation. Not a small gap. A gap of some 20 minutes and dozens of miles between the front of the strike force and the rear. The plan had called for all 5 groups to arrive over the target within minutes of one another. That plan was already dead over the mountains of Greece, and not one man in the formation could say so out loud, because the microphones were cold and the order was silence. And then it got worse, because the enemy already knew they were coming. This is the cruelest fact of the entire operation, and it deserves to be stated flatly. The surprise, the one thing the entire plan rested on, the thing they had traded altitude and safety and everything else to preserve, was already gone. German signals intelligence had been monitoring the radio traffic of the 9th Air Force in Libya. When that traffic went suddenly, conspicuously silent, the Germans understood exactly what silence meant. Something big was moving. And the commander of the Ploesti defenses had been expecting exactly this kind of attack, and had prepared for it with a thoroughness that the American planners never came close to appreciating. That commander was a German general named Alfred Gerstenberg, and he had spent 2 years turning Ploesti into one of the most heavily defended targets in all of Europe. This is the intelligence failure at the black heart of the whole raid. The crews had been briefed that Ploesti was defended by fewer than 100 heavy guns and a modest fighter presence. The reality was staggeringly worse. Gerstenberg had ringed the refineries with hundreds of anti-aircraft guns of every caliber. Heavy 88mm guns for altitude and dense belts of lighter, faster-firing weapons for exactly the kind of low-level attack that was coming. He had hidden guns inside haystacks, inside railway cars, inside fake buildings and farm sheds. He had a fire control radar network. He had smoke generators to blind the bombardiers. He had over 20 barrage balloons flying steel cables above the refineries. And he had fighters, German Messerschmitts and Romanian machines, waiting on nearby fields. He had even built a disguised flak train, a string of railway cars with their sides that dropped away to reveal anti-aircraft guns, which could race along the rail lines and ambush low-flying bombers. The crews had a nickname for it afterward. They called it the Caterpillar. None of this was in the briefing. The men flew into it blind. It is worth pausing on Gerstenberg, because he is the man who truly beat this raid, and almost none of the Americans who flew it had ever heard his name. Alfred Gerstenberg was a Luftwaffe general who had flown alongside the great German flyers in the First World War, and he had been sent to Romania to protect the one resource Germany could not fight without. He treated the assignment as the work of his life. Over 2 years, he built up the defenses of Ploesti until they were, by many accounts, among the most heavily defended targets in all of Europe, spoken of in the same breath as Berlin and the Ruhr. He did not simply add guns. He built a system, layered and cross-checked, guns and radar and fighters and smoke and balloons, all designed to work together against precisely the kind of attack the Americans were about to attempt. That is the bitterest part. American intelligence knew Gerstenberg was there and still, somehow, briefed the crews for a small fraction of what he had actually built. The men were sent against the masterpiece of an enemy professional. They were told to expect an amateur. The bombers came down out of the mountains and onto the Romanian plain and dropped to the deck for the final run-in, following the rail lines and rivers that were their landmarks toward Ploesti. And it was here, at the last critical navigation point, that the mission suffered the blow from which it never recovered. The route had been carefully laid out through a series of checkpoints, towns whose shapes the lead navigators had memorized. The plan was to fly to a town called Ploesti, northwest of Ploesti, and make the final turn there, coming in on the refineries from an angle that lined each group up on its assigned target. But at an earlier town, at Targoviste, the lead group turned too soon. Compton, in the lead airplane, with General Ent aboard, turned southeast onto the wrong railway line, a line that led not to the refineries, but toward Bucharest, the Romanian capital, well south of the target. And Baker's group, the Circus, followed the leader as it was supposed to, straight down the wrong path. Now, the men in those airplanes were not fools, and several of them knew immediately that something was wrong. Down the formation, crews could see they were heading for a city that was plainly too big to be Ploesti. Some broke radio silence in desperation, calling out that this was the wrong way, that the target was behind them. And in the lead aircraft of the Circus, Lieutenant Colonel Addison Baker looked out to his left, saw the refinery smokestacks of Ploesti standing on the horizon in the wrong place, understood in an instant what had happened, and made a decision that cost him his life and very likely saved the mission from being a total, empty failure. He hauled his group into a hard left turn, off the planned route, off the assigned approach, and drove straight at Ploesti from the wrong direction, low and level, leading his men into the teeth of the defenses to put bombs on the target at any cost. And the defenses were ready and waiting. What happened next, across the refineries of Ploesti in the space of about half an hour, is almost impossible to convey. The bombers came in at rooftop height into a firestorm of anti-aircraft fire, unlike anything in the experience of any man there. Guns firing horizontally, level with the airplanes, so that gunners on the ground and gunners in the air were shooting straight into each other's faces at point-blank range. The Caterpillar, the flak train, running alongside the bombers and dueling with them gun for gun. Balloon cables reaching up, fighters slashing in. And the bombers held their courses, straight and level, because at 200 feet on a bomb run there is nowhere to hide and nothing to do but fly through it. The flak train made it personal in a way that stayed with the survivors for the rest of their lives. Here was a string of what looked like ordinary railway cars. And as the bombers thundered along the rail line toward the refineries, the sides of the cars dropped away and the guns inside them opened up, running parallel to the airplanes, matching their speed, dueling with the Liberator's own gunners across a few hundred feet of Romanian farmland at better than 200 miles an hour. Men in the waist windows and the top turrets fired back at the train as it raced alongside them. Two machines built for entirely different purposes, locked in a running gun battle at the height of a farmhouse roof. Some of the bombers killed the guns that were firing on them. Some of the bombers were killed by them. And all of it happened in the few savage minutes it took to cross the ground between the last turn and the target. Baker and his co-pilot, Major John Jerstad, led the circus into the fire in an airplane named Hell's Wench. Now, Jerstad did not have to be there at all. He had already completed his required combat tour. He could have gone home. He volunteered to fly this mission, in the lead, in the most exposed position in the entire formation. Their airplane was hit almost at once, hit hard, set on fire. Baker could have put it down in the open fields that were right there beneath him. Instead, he held the burning bomber on course, kept the lead, guided his group onto the target through the flames, and only at the last moment, with the airplane finished, tried to gain enough height for his crew to jump. There was not enough height. Hell's Wench went into the ground, and everyone aboard was killed. Addison Baker and John Jerstad were both awarded the Medal of Honor, both after death. The historian James Dugan, whose book Ploesti, written with Carol Stewart, remains the foundational account of this raid, gathered the testimony of the men who watched it happen, and the picture that comes through is of a group commander who chose, with full knowledge, to die at the front of his formation rather than lead it anywhere but onto the target. Behind the lead groups came Kane's Pyramiders and Johnson's 8 Balls, and they arrived to a nightmare on top of a nightmare. Because of the gap that had opened back over the mountains, they came in minutes late, and they came in to find their targets already burning, already wrapped in the smoke and fire set by the airplanes ahead of them. The delayed action bombs dropped by the earlier waves were now cooking off underneath them. The refineries were exploding as they arrived. And Kane, Killer Kane, took his group straight into that inferno, into a target so obscured by smoke and flame that the men could barely see what they were bombing, flying through the heat of the fires and the storm of the guns to put their bombs into the largest refinery of them all. Kane's own airplane, Hail Columbia, was shot to pieces, lost an engine, and staggered away from the target, barely flying, eventually to crash land far away on the island of Cyprus. John Kane was awarded the Medal of Honor and lived to wear it. Leon Johnson, leading the 8 Balls, faced the same horror. His assigned refinery had already been struck in the confusion, already set ablaze, and by every reasonable measure he could have turned his men away from a target that was burning and defended and wreathed in delayed bombs. He led them in anyway, straight down into it, and his group put their bombs on the target and paid for it in airplanes and men. Leon Johnson was awarded the Medal of Honor, and like Kane, he survived to receive it. Stop and count for a moment because it matters. Of the 5 men who earned the Medal of Honor at Ploesti, 4 of them, Baker, Jerstad, Kane, and Johnson, earned it in that single stretch of a few minutes over the burning refineries. That is not a coincidence. That is what it took just to complete the bomb run. The valor was not the exception at Ploesti. The valor was the mission. The 5th Medal of Honor went to the youngest of them, and his story is the one I find hardest to get through. 2nd Lieutenant Lloyd Hughes was 22 years old, flying with Wood's Sky Scorpions against the refinery up at Campina in an airplane called Old Kickapoo. On the run-in, his Liberator was hit and began streaming raw gasoline from ruptured tanks in the bomb bay and the wing, trailing a spray of fuel into air that was full of fire. Hughes could see the flames ahead. He had to have known, everyone who saw it knew, that flying a fuel-soaked airplane into that wall of fire meant almost certain death, and that there were open fields all around him where he could have set down and lived. His citation says it plainly, that he could have made a forced landing in any of the grain fields readily available at that time. He did not. He held his course, flew through the flames, dropped his bombs on the target, and only then, with the airplane burning, tried to put it down along a riverbed. It did not survive the landing. 2 of his gunners were thrown clear and lived. Lloyd Hughes did not. He was 22. Not every part of the raid was chaos, and the exceptions are their own kind of heartbreak. Down at the refinery at Brazi, a smaller force from the 8 Balls, led by Lieutenant Colonel James Posey, came in almost exactly as the plan had drawn it up. They found their target, hit it hard and accurately, and wrecked it so thoroughly that Brazi was the one major refinery genuinely knocked out for a long time to come, and Posey's element did it without losing a single airplane over the target itself. Far to the north, Jack Wood's Sky Scorpions, the newest and least blooded group of them all, the ones everyone had quietly worried about, made the cleanest attack of the whole mission against the refinery at Campina, striking almost precisely as they had rehearsed it in the desert. And I find that contrast almost unbearably instructive. When the surprise held, when a group came in on the right heading against a target that was not already an inferno, the plan worked. The bombing was accurate, the losses were survivable, the objective went down, which tells you the concept was not insane. It tells you the concept was fragile. It worked beautifully right, up until the instant it did not. And the difference between the groups that got in clean and the groups that were slaughtered came down to a wrong turn, 20 minutes, and a surprise that had already been surrendered. I have read a great many combat citations, and I want to say something about that phrase. Could have made a forced landing in any of the grain fields readily available. Someone sat down after the battle and worked out, from the testimony of the survivors, that this young man had a way out, an obvious, survivable way out, and chose the target instead. That is the kind of decision that the word heroism was invented to describe. And it is also, if we are honest, the kind of decision that a bad plan extracts from good men. Hughes should never have been put in a position where the only way to do his duty was to fly a leaking airplane into a fire. But he was, and he did, and he died doing it. And then, for the men who had made it through, there was the long way home. Getting to Ploesti had been agony. Getting away from it was its own ordeal. The surviving bombers, many of them shot half to pieces, some flying on 3 engines or 2, streaming fuel, full of wounded men, now had to fight their way back across hundreds of miles of hostile territory. Fighters harried them all the way. German machines, Romanian machines, and later Bulgarian fighters rose up to hunt the stragglers. 2 liberators collided over Yugoslavia. A cluster of them were caught and shot down out over the Ionian Sea, almost within sight of safety. Some airplanes, too damaged to make the full return to Libya, diverted to Cyprus or to Sicily. Some ditched in the sea, and a number unable to reach any friendly field crossed into neutral Turkey and landed there, where their crews were interned for the duration. One battered Liberator is said to have reached its base after some 14 hours in the air, carrying more than 300 bullet and shrapnel holes. Of the 177 bombers that had pressed on past the takeoff crash, only about 88 made it back to Benghazi, and more than 50 of those were so badly damaged they might never fly again. The rest were scattered across the map, down in the fields around Ploesti, in the sea, interned in Turkey. Crash landed on Cyprus, gone. The men who came down alive over Romania entered a strange and uncertain limbo. More than 100 became prisoners of the Axis, held in Romanian camps, where by most accounts they were treated with a rough decency that would not have survived the trip to a German cell, and many of them were eventually freed in 1944 when Romania turned against Germany and changed sides. The 70-odd men who reached Turkey and put down there were interned under the rules that govern neutral ground, and they trickled home over the following months through the quiet machinery of diplomacy and escape. And a small number, who had come down in Yugoslavia, were found and hidden and helped along by Tito's partisans, and made their way back to Allied lines by routes that would fill a film of their own. Every one of those journeys is a story in itself, and almost none of them are ever told. Now let me put hard numbers to the cost, and let me be honest about where the numbers are disputed, because on a raid like this, the accounting itself becomes contested, and you deserve the real picture rather than a tidy one. The most commonly cited figure for aircraft lost is 53 Liberators. The official Army Air Force's history compiled by Craven and Kate gives the figure as 54 aircraft lost, 41 of them directly in the action. The Imperial War Museum's American Air Museum reconciles the counts by noting that 57 Liberators were lost in total when you add the ones that went down in the sea to the ones lost over Ploesti itself. Which number is right depends entirely on what you choose to count. Airplanes destroyed over the target, airplanes that ditched, airplanes interned in Turkey, airplanes written off after limping home. However you tally it, somewhere between 53 and 57 of the bombers that set out that morning were gone by the end of the day, out of a force of fewer than 180. Do that arithmetic, and you arrive at a loss rate of roughly 30% in a single mission. And among the groups that came in late into the fires, the rate was far higher still. The human cost is harder to pin down and more painful to read. The historian J. Stout, in his campaign history, Fortress Ploesti, gives an accounting of roughly 310 men killed or missing, 108 taken prisoner by the Axis, 78 interned in Turkey, and a handful who came down among Tito's partisans in Yugoslavia. Add those categories together, and you get the figure often quoted for this raid, that around 660 men did not come back to their bases that night. The official history frames it a little differently, stating that of the airmen who went out, some 532 were dead, captured, missing, or interned. The disagreement is not carelessness. It is the fog of a battle this size and this chaotic. But whether the figure you settle on is 532 or 660, understand what it represents. Of roughly 1,750 young men who took off from the desert that morning, somewhere between a third and a half were killed, wounded, captured, or lost by nightfall. There is no softer way to say it. There's a further cost that rarely makes it into the retelling, and honesty requires it. The bombing was low, and it was violent, and it did not stay neatly on the refineries. On the ground, in and around Ploesti, something like 100 civilians were killed, and well over 200 more were injured. In one of the war's small, terrible accidents, a crippled liberator came down onto a women's prison and killed many of those trapped inside. The men in the airplanes did not choose that, and they could not have prevented it at 200 feet in the middle of a firestorm. But it belongs in the account, because the cost of a raid is never only the cost to the men who fly it. And a channel that tells you the truth about the airmen owes you the truth about the ground beneath them as well. For their valor, the men of Ploesti received 5 Medals of Honor, the most ever granted for one air action in the history of the United States, along with 56 Distinguished Service Crosses and 41 Silver Stars, and unit citations for all 5 groups. Every man who flew the mission earned at least the Distinguished Flying Cross. The decorations tell you, in the language of the military, exactly how hard the fighting was. You do not hand out 5 Medals of Honor for a mission that went according to plan, so they had paid. Now comes the question that makes Ploesti one of the most bitter stories in the whole air war. What did they get for it? And the honest answer, the answer the evidence supports, is very little. In the immediate aftermath, the assessments were hopeful. The bombing had been accurate. The low-level plan had, in that narrow sense, worked. Reconnaissance suggested that around 40% of Ploesti's refining capacity had been knocked out. On paper, that looked like a serious blow. But the paper was lying, and here's why. Stephen Zaloga, whose recent study, Ploesti 1943, is the sharpest modern analysis of the raid, points to the fact that undoes the whole thing. The Ploesti refineries had been operating well below their maximum capacity. There was slack in the system. So when the raid destroyed a large slice of the working plant, the Germans simply brought idle, undamaged capacity back online to make up the difference. General Gerstenberg, the same man whose defenses had savaged the raid, put the refineries back together with reserve equipment and forced labor with astonishing speed. The largest refinery of them all was back at full output within a few months. Another was running at 100% of its previous level by the middle of September, barely 6 weeks after the attack. And within a short time, the total output of oil flowing out of Ploesti was as high as it had been before the raid, and by some measures higher, because the repairs swept away old bottlenecks. An Allied intelligence appraisal a few weeks after the raid concluded there had been no real reduction in overall product output. The United States Strategic Bombing Survey, the enormous post-war study that examined what the bombing campaigns had actually accomplished, delivered the verdict in its cool, understated way. The August 1943 attack on Ploesti, it concluded, had only limited effects, and deliveries of oil actually increased in the months that followed, until the refineries were attacked again in the spring of 1944. Read that sentence again and let it land. Oil deliveries went up after the raid. The most costly single day in American air history, measured against its own objective, did not turn off the taproot. It barely turned the valve. There is one more consequence, and it is grim. The raid did not just fail to shut down Ploesti. It gutted the striking power of the bomber force that made it. The 9th Bomber Command was reduced to something like 33 serviceable liberators after Black Sunday. It was in no condition to go back, And so Ploesti was left largely alone for the next 8 months, free to pump oil for the German war machine, until an entirely different campaign, high-altitude bombing by the 15th Air Force flying out of Italy in 1944, finally did the job that Tidal Wave had been sold as doing in a single stroke. The low-level gamble had cost a third of the force, achieved a temporary dent, and then removed the very capability needed to follow up. It is difficult to design a worse outcome. When the real reckoning with Ploesti finally came, it came the way the doctrine had originally promised, from high altitude, in strength, and over time. Beginning in the spring of 1944, the 15th Air Force, flying from bases in Italy, went back to Ploesti again and again, in daylight and at altitude, in exactly the kind of sustained campaign that fewer than 200 bombers on a single afternoon could never have delivered. The Royal Air Force mined the Danube to strangle the oil moving out by river. It was grinding, and it was costly, and it took months, and it was, in the end, what actually worked. By the late summer of that year, the refineries had been beaten down for good, and when Romania changed sides in August of 1944, Gerstenberg's long defense of the taproot was over, and the general himself was taken prisoner before the year was out. The lesson is not complicated, but it is worth saying plainly. The thing that Tidal Wave tried to accomplish in a single low-level stroke took an entire Air Force the better part of a year to do properly. The shortcut did not exist. The men who died looking for it were chasing something that was never there to find. So how do we weigh this? How do we hold the almost unbelievable courage of the men against the emptiness of the result? I have thought about this a great deal, and I want to give you my honest assessment because that is what this channel is for. I do not believe the men who flew Tidal Wave failed. I believe they were failed. They flew their airplanes exactly as asked. They pressed their attacks with a determination that produced 5 medals of honor in half an hour. When the plan fell apart around them, when the navigation went wrong and the surprise was gone and their targets were already burning, they did not turn away. They went in. The execution by the crews was very nearly flawless in spirit, whatever the chaos of the moment. Everything that failed at Ploesti failed above them and before them. It failed at the level of intelligence, which told them 100 guns when the truth was hundreds upon hundreds. It failed at the level of planning, which built an entire operation on a surprise that a single burst of radio silence had already surrendered. It failed at the level of the doctrine itself, the seductive belief that you could find one vital target and reach out and kill an enemy's war economy in an afternoon, when the reality was that the enemy had reserve capacity and forced labor, and a general named Gerstenberg who put it all back together while the survivors were still being counted. And here, I want to name a pattern, because it is bigger than this one raid. If you have ever watched a plan handed down from people who were nowhere near the actual work, a plan that looked elegant on the chart and impossible on the ground, and watched the people who had to carry it out get blamed or buried when it fell apart exactly the way that people on the ground could have told you it would, then you already understand something essential about Ploesti. The men in the cockpits could not break radio silence to fix the formation. They could not tell the planners that 100 guns was a fantasy. They could only fly the mission they were given into the consequences of decisions made far from the target by men who would never see the wheat coming up to meet the propellers. That is the pattern this channel keeps finding in campaign after campaign. It does not usually get this many people killed in a single day. At Ploesti, it did. Let me be fair to the other side of the ledger, though, because honest assessment cuts both ways. There's a defensive tidal wave, and it deserves a hearing. The target came down from Casablanca as a priority, and the range problem was real. And given fewer than 200 bombers, a conventional high-altitude campaign genuinely could not have destroyed Ploesti either. Colonel Smart was not choosing between a safe plan and a dangerous one. He was choosing between a dangerous plan and no plan at all. The low-level attack was a gamble, but it was a gamble taken against a genuinely hard problem. And the thing that broke it was not the concept, but the loss of surprise, which came from a source. The radio silence being read as a warning that the planners could not easily have foreseen. Historians will argue this one forever, and they should, because it is a real argument. My own view, for what it is worth, is that a plan whose entire survival depends on perfect surprise, flown by heavy bombers at 200 feet against a defended target hundreds of miles inside enemy territory, was a plan with too little margin for the ordinary friction of war, and that the men deserved a better bet than the one they were handed. But I hold that view knowing that reasonable people, including some who were there, have held the opposite. There is one part of this story I want to make sure we get exactly right, because it has been told wrong for decades, and this audience cares about getting it right. The old version of events, the one you will find in many of the early accounts, says that the disaster flowed from the loss of the lead navigator when Wongo Wongo went to the sea, as if that one crash doomed the mission's navigation. But the careful modern research, drawing on the testimony of survivors like Robert Sternfels and others who have spent decades reconstructing the mission, makes clear that Wongo Wongo was not actually the strike lead. The lead airplane, the one setting the course at the critical moment, was Teggy Ann, with Compton flying and General Ent aboard. Which means the fatal wrong turn at Targovist was not the inevitable result of a navigator lost over the Mediterranean. It was a decision made in the lead airplane by the men in command at the head of the formation. Compton himself, speaking about it many years later, acknowledged that he had led from the front the whole way. I raise this not to pile blame onto one man in a chaotic battle, but because the truth matters. And the truth is that the turn onto the wrong railway line, the mistake that cost the mission its coordination and sent the lead groups toward Bucharest while the target stood off to the side, happened at the very top of the formation, not in a lost airplane at the bottom of the sea. Getting that right is the difference between a story about bad luck and a story about command. And this was, in the end, a story about command. If you want to read further on this, and I hope you will, the essential starting point remains the account by James Dugan and Carol Stewart, titled simply Ploesti, built from the testimony of the men who were actually there. For the wider campaign around the raid, J. Stout's fortress Ploesti is the fullest modern treatment, and Dwayne Schultz, in his narrative Into the Fire, tells the human story vividly, though specialists will tell you to read it alongside the more analytical work rather than on its own. Stephen Zaloga's study is the one I lean on hardest for the numbers and for the enemy's side of the fight. And behind all of them stands the patient record-keeping of Roger Freeman, whose accounting of the American bomber effort remains the backbone that nearly everyone else builds upon. I name them deliberately, because you deserve to know where this comes from, and because the difference between history and mere content is that history tells you whom to go and check. Now, a word for the men who know their airplanes, because you will be looking at the pictures and you will want to know that we have this right. The bombers over Ploesti were B-24D model Liberators, the definitive early Liberator variant, 4 Pratt and Whitney radial engines of about 1,200 horsepower each, a wingspan of 110 feet, that long, high, slab-sided Davis wing that gave the airplane its range and its ungainly look. If you see these airplanes rendered with the later tail turret silhouette of the J model, or drawn as anything but the D, that is wrong for this date. Watch the national markings, too. On the 1st of August, 1943, the correct American insignia was the white star on the blue disc with the white bars, and crucially, at this precise moment, that insignia carried a red border around it. That red surround was official for only a short window in the summer of 1943 before it was changed to blue, and Ploesti falls squarely inside that window. So the red-bordered star and bar is correct for these airplanes, though you should know that application varied in the field and not every airplane in the force wore it identically. And there is one marking you must never see on a Ploesti Liberator. Invasion stripes, those bold black and white bands, belong to June of 1944 in the Normandy landings. They are almost a year in the future on the day of this raid. Any Ploesti airplane wearing invasion stripes is a mistake, and it is exactly the kind of mistake this audience will catch in a heartbeat. As for finish, some of these Liberators wore the standard olive drab over gray of the European theater, and others, the desert-based airplanes, wore pink and sand desert camouflage that gave one group the nickname the Pink Elephants. Both are correct. That variety is part of what makes the day look the way it did. There's a photograph from this raid that many of you will have seen, a Liberator called the Sandman coming across a burning refinery so low it looks like it is threading between the buildings, smoke towering behind it. That one image tells you almost everything about what these men flew into. It is worth remembering, when you look at it, that the airplane in that picture is not posing. It is in the middle of the worst day of its crew's lives, and the reason we can see it so clearly is that it was flying at the height of a house, straight into a wall of fire, because the mission said to. I want to bring this back to the human scale, where it belongs, before we finish. The refineries at Ploesti were repaired. The oil kept flowing. The strategic result of Operation Tidal Wave, measured honestly, was close to nothing. A few weeks of disruption bought at a price that staggers the mind. But the men were not nothing. Addison Baker, holding a burning airplane on course so his group could reach the target. John Jerstad, who had already earned his ticket home and flew the lead anyway. Lloyd Hughes, 22 years old, choosing the target over the open field and the survivable landing. John Kane and Leon Johnson, leading their groups down into fires that any sane man would have flown around. And the hundreds of others whose names are not on citations, the waist gunners and the navigators and the flight engineers, the men down among the wheat who flew into the smoke because they had been told to and did not turn away. Whatever we conclude about the plan, and I have been hard on the plan, we should never let the failure of the plan bleed onto the men who executed it. They gave everything the mission asked, and the mission asked for everything. If your father or grandfather flew with the Liberandos, the traveling circus, the pyramiders, the 8 balls, or the sky scorpions, or worked the flight line at Benghazi that summer, I would like to hear about it. Those stories are the real record of this raid, and they matter more than any figure I can quote. Drop them in the comments. Ploesti stands as one of the clearest cases the air war ever produced of the gap between the theory and the blood. A beautiful idea that you could reach out and kill an enemy's war economy at a single vital point, carried out with extraordinary courage against a reality that had reserve capacity and hidden guns, and a defender who had been waiting for exactly this. The men flew a perfect mission into an imperfect plan, and the plan is what failed. 53 airplanes, and by some counts more. Hundreds of men. 5 medals of honor in half an hour over the refineries. And within weeks, the oil was flowing again as if none of it had happened. That is the arithmetic of Black Sunday, and it is worth sitting with, because it is the arithmetic that this whole channel exists to understand. The men who fly are asked to pay for the theories of the men who plan. And at Ploesti, on the 1st of August, 1943, the bill came due all at once. That's the story. The sources are in the description. I'll see you in the next one.